All right, let's talk about that big stack of paper millions of us signed, sometimes without even reading the fine print. Yep, the lease agreement. We're going to cut right through all that legal jargon and turn it into something you can actually use, a real renter's guide.
So, be honest for a second. Have you ever been handed one of those super thick leases, felt that pressure to just sign, and kinda skipped right to the last page? Hey, you are not alone. These things can feel super intimidating, but, and this is key, understanding what's in your lease is hands down the best way to protect yourself as a tenant. So, let's dive in.
Okay, so here's what we're going to cover. First, the two halves of a lease agreement. Then, the four main types of tenancy. After that, we'll get into the rules of the game, your rights versus your responsibilities, and finally, what happens when the lease ends.
All right, Section 1, the agreement's two halves. It's more than just a piece of paper. The thing is, a lease isn't just one thing. It's really two big legal ideas rolled into a single document.
So you can think of a lease as wearing two different hats. The first hat is all about the property. It's what's called a conveyance. This is the part that gives you the right to the actual physical space, the keys to the door. Legally, they call this privity of estate. The second hat is the contract. This is the rule book. It lays out everything from how much rent you pay to your maintenance duties. And the legal term for that? Privity of contract. So you've got the space and you've got the rules. Both are super important.
Okay, moving on to the four types of tenancy. It's really important to ask, what kind of agreement do you actually have? Because not all leases are the same. They generally fall into four main buckets based on their duration, and you really need to know which one you're in.
So here are the four flavors, laid out pretty simply. You've got your estate for years, which is just a fixed period. Then periodic tenancy, the one that keeps repeating, like month to month. Estate at will is indefinite. And finally, estate at sufferance, which is what happens when you're a holdover. Let's break these down one by one so they make more sense. First up, estate for years. Now I know, that sounds super old-fashioned and complicated, but it's really, really simple. It just means your lease has a clear start date and a clear end date. That's it. It could be a one-year lease, could be a 2-month summer rental. The key thing is, on that final day, it just ends. Automatically. No notice needed.
All right, next is the periodic tenancy, and this is probably the one you're most familiar with. We usually just call it a month-to-month lease. It just keeps rolling over month after month until either you or your landlord gives proper written notice to end it. And yeah, it's super common for a reason. It gives everyone a little bit of flexibility.
Okay, now for an estate at will. This one's a little less common, a bit more informal. Basically, there's no set end date. The lease just kind of lasts as long as both of you agree it should. Now I know what you're thinking. That sounds risky, right? Like you could be kicked out tomorrow. But nope, that's not how it works. Most states, like California for example, require the landlord to give you proper notice, usually 30 days, before they can end things. And last, we have the estate at sufferance. This is the legal term for when your lease is up, the clock has run out, but you haven't moved out. You're still there. You become what's known as a holdover tenant. It's an interesting spot to be in, because you're not exactly a trespasser, you came in legally after all, but you don't have the right to be there anymore. At this point, your landlord has a choice to make, either start the eviction process, or maybe offer you a new lease.
Okay, we've got the types down. Now let's get into the rules of the game, getting it in writing and making it official. So the big question here is, when does a lease have to be a written document? Well, there's this old law called the Statute of Frauds, and it sets the rules. It's actually pretty straightforward for our purposes. The big one, remember, is this. If your lease is for longer than 1 year, it has to be in writing. Period. There's another little wrinkle there, but honestly, the main takeaway is that for any kind of long-term rental, a simple handshake deal just isn't going to cut it legally.
But let's be really, really clear about this. Forget the law for a second. Even if you're just doing a month-to-month thing, always get it in writing. I mean it. A verbal agreement is just asking for a he said, she said nightmare down the road. A written lease is your single best protection against future disagreements. No question.
All right, let's get to the real heart of the lease. Rights versus responsibilities. This is all about what you get and what you owe. Okay, this is a big one. It's called the Covenant of Quiet Enjoyment. And the key word here is implied. It means that this right is baked into every single lease, even if it's not written down in black and white. It's your fundamental right to peacefully live in your home without your landlord constantly bothering you. So that landlord who likes to just drop by unannounced all the time, yeah, they're likely violating your right to quiet enjoyment.
Landlords also have a huge responsibility to keep the property safe.
Now, they're not responsible for every little thing that could possibly go wrong, but they can absolutely be held liable for injuries if they were negligent. What does that mean? Well, it could be that they didn't fix something dangerous they knew about, or should have known about. Or maybe they knew about a hidden defect, like some faulty wiring, and didn't tell you. Or, and this is a common one, they agreed to fix something and then did a terrible job or just never did it at all.
So that's what the landlord owes you. Now, what do you owe them? Well, the biggest one, of course, is paying the rent. I love this quote. Rent is the consideration paid for possession, use, and enjoyment of leased property. Consideration is just the legal word for the thing of value you exchange. So you're not just paying a bill, you're paying for the right to live there, to use the space, and to enjoy it peacefully.
But that brings up a really important question, doesn't it? Your duty to pay rent is directly linked to your landlord's duty to provide a decent, livable home. So what if they don't hold up their end of the bargain? What happens if the place becomes unlivable?
Well, if things get really bad, and I mean like no heat in the dead of winter, a massive leak in the roof, something that makes the place genuinely unlivable, and your landlord just ignores it, you might be looking at something called a constructive eviction. This is a huge deal. It basically means the landlord has effectively evicted you by making the place impossible to live in. And if that's the case, you may have the right to reduce your rent or even vacate the property and break the lease entirely.
All right, we're in the home stretch, our final section, when the lease ends. Because, all tenancies eventually conclude one way or another.
So what happens if you, the tenant, break a rule in the lease? The most common one is failing to pay rent. Well, the landlord can't just change the locks. There's a process. First, they have to serve you an official notice. This is usually called a notice to cure or quit. It gives you a very short window, maybe just 3 days, to either cure the problem, which means pay the rent, or quit the premises, which means move out. And only if you do neither of those things can the landlord take the next step to formally terminate the lease.
Okay, but let's say that happens. You get the notice, the deadline comes and goes, and you're still there. This is where things can get really intense. What can the landlord legally do at this point? Can they just physically throw you out? Can they change the locks and put your stuff on the curb?
No. 1,000 times no. That is absolutely 100% illegal. A landlord cannot, under any circumstances, take matters into their own hands. Doing stuff like changing the locks, shutting off your utilities, or moving your belongings out, that's called a self-help eviction, and it will get them in a whole lot of legal trouble.
The only lawful way to remove a tenant is to go through the court system. The landlord has to file a lawsuit, which is usually called an unlawful detainer action. They have to go before a judge and prove their case. If the judge rules in their favor, they get a court order. And even then, it's not the landlord who comes to kick you out. It's the sheriff or another law enforcement official who is legally authorized to remove you from the property.
So when you boil it all down, knowing your rights is absolutely the first step. And the second step? Communication. Your lease should be a tool for that, not a trap. So I'll leave you with this question. Is your lease a clear agreement that helps you and your landlord understand each other, or is it a source of future conflict just waiting to happen?